Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar called Unlocking Creative Data Analysis. So this event is hosted by Policy Press, who are an imprint of Bristol University Press. So thanks all for joining us. I'm really excited to be at this event and hear the talks. So my name's Dawn Manny, and I'm a Professor of Creative Research Methodologies at Cardiff University. And I'm here to facilitate because I was an editor, so I was really privileged to be an editor on the Handbook of Creative Data Analysis with Helen Carruthers, who can't be here today. So through editing the book, we learned so much about creative ways to engage with and analyse data. So I'm very excited today to have four speakers who are going to be telling you about some of their chapters in the book. And our other editor in the team was Ali Roy, so I'll just hand over quickly to Ali to say hello.
Hi, everybody. So just brilliant to be here, and thanks to everybody who's attending, and in particular, fantastic to have four of our authors from the book and to get to hear about their examples. And really, I think that's what this book does. We recognized when we started thinking about this book that many people were searching for usable examples of doing data analysis creatively. And we asked everybody who wrote a chapter in the book to try and describe their approach in enough detail that somebody else could kind of pick it up and use it, or pick up elements of it and use it. And I think they've all delivered on that beautifully. And I think, what the different chapters in this book provide for us is different possibilities for thinking with our data, different possibilities for approaching things. And there's lovely examples of how people have combined different approaches, in some case more traditional approaches with creative approaches. So I think it's going to be great, to hear people talk about some of those examples in the book today. So thanks for coming, and I'll hand back to Dawn.
Okay, thanks, Ali. So thanks to Helen Carr again, whose fantastic idea it was to bring the book together. And thank you also to our chapter authors, both for contributing to the book and for coming today. So we have four speakers that I'm delighted to introduce. So we've got Kate Carruthers Thomas, who's Senior Research Fellow at Birmingham City University. And Kate will be discussing a case study transforming online survey data into a graphic novella. And then Louise Gascoine, Associate Professor in the School of Education at Durham University, will be discussing her work with word clouds and showing how they can be used to capture complexity, context, and narrative. Then Karen Hammond, lecturer in criminology and criminal justice at the University of West Scotland, is going to reflect on some of the challenges of pushing methodological boundaries when we analyse our data. And then lastly, Jess Mannion, Research Fellow at the University of Leeds, will be talking through how she specialises in co-produced research with people with learning disabilities and autism, and uses a range of exciting visual and creative research methodologies. So before we get to all the exciting stuff, I've just got to do some housekeeping. So I will need to read this to make sure I don't get anything wrong. So please type questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And then at the end, me and Ali will put those to panelists. So you can also upvote questions if you're interested in them too. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat instead of the Q&A function. We've got closed captions enabled on this webinar. So there's a button at the bottom of your screen, CC Live Transcript. So please use this to show or hide the text as you prefer. Attendees can order Bristol University Press books at 50% discount. And you can use the code DSC50 at the checkout, but we'll share these links in the chat. Bristol University Press are also kindly offering a free ebook. So Helen Carruthers' great creative research methods book. So you can simply add your name and email address to their newsletter, and you'll be able to get a copy of that ebook. and a recording of the webinar will be available after the event. So that's all housekeeping. And now I'm really pleased to hand over to Carruthers Thomas for the first talk.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Dawn. Thanks, Ali. Thanks, Policy Press. I'm just going to share my screen. The slideshow bit is hidden by all the other bits that are going on. Okay. Can you see my screen okay? Right, okay. Good morning. Great to be here, and thank you for the invitation to talk about my chapter in this fantastic collection. So my chapter focuses on the creative analytic process of transforming quantitative data gathered via an online survey into a graphic novella. The novella is called 5 Survive Lockdown. I self-published it in 2021, and to date I've sold nearly 200 copies. In this process of revisualizing and disseminating research, the relationships of statistics, words, and images were disrupted, just as the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted our world. And this whole story starts with COVID-19. To move my thing on, and it's not working. Got it. So I'm a transdisciplinary academic. I bring sociological, geographical, and educational theories and concepts to bear on primarily qualitative research into gendered issues of work in contemporary higher education. And in June 2020, during the first UK COVID lockdown, I wanted to find out about the experiences of academic and professional staff in my own urban modern university who were living and working through the pandemic. And I wanted to better understand the gendered nature of those experiences. I conducted an online survey open to all staff, which received 543 responses, meaning I was very much out of my comfort zone in terms of analysis. So to cut a long story short, I relied on a statistical expert colleague to analyse the data in terms of statistical significance. And our findings were that the impacts of living and working in the COVID-19 lockdown were asymmetric and gendered. Women were disproportionately disadvantaged in terms of access to dedicated working space. At home, the burden of care in the household, including homeschooling, and the disruption of work-home boundaries. And in addition, female academic staff had experienced specific challenges in terms of research productivity. So I presented the detail of our analyses in a report entitled Living and Working in Lockdown, What's Gender Got to Do with It?, which was published internally within my university. And as I describe in the chapter, that's where the story was supposed to end. But in fact, what happened was that I felt something was missing, or in fact, a great deal was missing. So as a qualitative interpretivist researcher, what I was missing was the emotionally sensed knowledge I would normally use in interpreting the data. What I was missing was the complex, effective stories behind the statistics that I glimpsed in the free text responses in the survey. So I decided to use my graphic social science practice as a way to resolve these missing pieces, to transform the graphs and charts and bullets points of the survey report into a hand-drawn graphic narrative. And that required a lengthy, rigorous process of creative data analysis. And I've tried to separate the elements of that process here, although it is inevitably artificial as a separation. So there was the sketchbook phase, which is a combination of mind mapping, doodling, sketching, diagramming, and notes. Very messy, all over the place, but an exciting phase 2 of exploring possibilities and themes and threads. And then there was the scoping phase, in which I settled on a scope for the narrative. So a process very much informed by the survey data, which ranged across multiple professional and personal aspects of living and working through the lockdown, and the major survey themes of adapting to working or studying from home, homeschooling, caring responsibilities, well-being, and loss. Then there was the characterization phase. So 67% of survey respondents, and weirdly, 67% of respondents in academic roles had identified as female. I decided that the narrative would therefore tell the stories of 5 fictional female academics during the period March to September 2020. Preserving participant anonymity, I developed these 5 composite female characters at different stages of the academic career path, each positioned in particular ways to the themes and issues raised by the survey data. And the characters reflected the survey sample's age ranges, varied marital and parental statuses, and I also included an international doctoral student character, which allowed me to represent the very great concerns that survey respondents had voiced about the welfare of those students stuck in the UK during the pandemic lockdown. And then the storyline phase, as the chapter explains, survey data provided the starting points for the process of devising storylines. And for example, 54% of respondents had strongly agreed with the statement, "It has been very challenging to balance homeschooling and other tasks in my home with my workload during lockdown." And in the novella, that's represented through Neela and Jess's storylines, one living with extended family, the other with a preschool child. All the storylines also reflected academic-specific practices relevant to each character's job or career stage, and features of the pandemic, such as mutual aid, the hour of exercise, remember that, and clapping for carers. So I'll finish by saying that the continuation of the pandemic beyond 2020 meant that 5 Survive Lockdown became a historical document, even as I worked on it. It's a fictional version of that extraordinary period, grounded in research data. It's one of the most labour-intensive and rewarding projects that I've worked on, and this, plus the later research that I did into gendered experience of COVID, is indebted to the volume and nature of the data gathered through that first online survey. I hope you enjoy reading the chapter and the rest of the seminar. I'm very happy to take questions later. Thank you. Stop sharing.
Thanks very much, Kate. Really, really interesting. So we're going to have questions at the end. So I'm going to hand over now to Louise. Thank you.
Thanks, Dawn. Yeah, so morning everyone, hello. I'm going to talk a little bit about word clouds, which was the focus of the chapter that I contributed with my co-authors, Kate and Steve, to the creative data analysis book. And I want to start off by saying that word clouds are much, much more than a picture to jazz up a slide deck, and they're also much more than a visual representation alone of textual data. Or the frequency of words and phrases within a piece of text. And I want to share my ideas today about how word clouds can be harnessed to engage in creative data analysis that embraces context, narrative, and complexity. So I want to share with you a word cloud. First of all, the word cloud on the slide at the moment tells part of a story, and it's the story of the book chapter in the Creative Data Analysis Handbook. This word cloud is the whole chapter represented as a word cloud. And the data analysis in the example that I talk about in the chapter focused on metacognition, or thinking about thinking, in a sample of 374 students who were aged between 4 and 16 across 3 schools in Northeast England. And my engagement with word clouds in the piece of research wasn't in my plan from the outset. It was a product of reflection and grappling with a complex data set about a complex concept. So metacognition is a complex concept, and how to holistically take into account all of that complexity in the data analysis. It was also driven by a desire to stay close to the creative roots of the data collection tool. So the data collection tool that was used was a people view template, which was a visual mediator that was used as part of a focus group, where I asked students in focus groups to imagine a time where they learned something new. And that if these two students were in their classroom with them when they were learning something new, what would they be saying and what would they be thinking? And it took place in the context of focus groups with between 4 and 6 students, depending on the age of the students. I want to talk a little bit about context and narrative. So the word cloud on this slide here is much more, as I said, much more than a way to save putting lots of text on the slide or to explain it in a slightly different way. It's a window into the context of the data that was collected and the stories that are integral to that data. The context and the narrative were really important for us in the data analysis. The reality of the students and their learning experiences in school was key. And it was also really important for me to stay close to that, especially given that myself and the co-authors all have practitioner teacher backgrounds. Using word clouds in the data analysis facilitated a connection to the narratives, so the stories that were told in the focus groups, the students' narratives of learning something new. And that supported our understanding of where the data was situated in terms of the students' stories and the discussions that I had with the students in the focus groups about learning something new. So in this example on the slide, which was generated from a group of students aged between 4 and 5, part of the context and the story was that they were talking about learning about chicks hatching from eggs. And they were also talking about the context of learning Mandarin in their lessons at schools. And I do think without the inherent creativity of word clouds and how they helped us to visualize and compare the data in this way, it would have been really easy to lose a sense of the school and the learning contexts in which the data was situated. We were looking for developmental trends in metacognition and using statistical analysis to do that. And it would have been very easy for us to lose sight of the context and the story if we had only used the statistical analysis. So word clouds really did become an integral part of unlocking the context and developing understanding about the context, including the context in which different ways in which words were used across different age groups. That was something that came out of using word clouds, thinking about how verbs like remember were used by different ages of students and their role as part of students' what we called metacognitive vocabulary. That was a finding that was specific to working with word clouds creatively, that I don't think we would have thought about in the same way had we not also been engaged in this creative process with word clouds. I've mentioned complexity already a little bit, and it really was kind of key to everything. So the concept was complex, the data was complex, and the context was complex, and all of those things working together were really important to take into consideration. We needed a nuanced and a pragmatic approach to do that. And the creativity of word clouds and their links to the statistical analysis, because they allowed us to make visual comparisons across age groups, which aligned with the comparisons we were making using the statistical analysis. But it also really served as a reminder of the complexity of metacognition and how this is understood and what it looks like in school contexts for the students that we were talking to. So in that sense, word clouds gave us a really valuable statistical mnemonic that allowed us to compare and explore the stories of the data from the different age groups of participants. Avoiding reductionism was a really key aspect of this. We didn't want to reduce the really creative way that the data was collected using the pupil views templates to a statistical analysis and tables full of numbers. We really wanted to stay true to that creativity and the complexity of the practice context. So analysis using word clouds enabled us to think about the relations between different aspects of the stories told by the data, and it allowed us to foreground the whole story. And it was really important for us that we allowed that to sit alongside the deductive coding of the data and the statistical analysis. So in summary, they allowed us to do something of an analytic dance. So we were simultaneously close to the data, but we were also able to have an overview and the context at the same time, in this creative and visual way, using word clouds and looping back to the creativity of the initial data collection using people-views templates. Thank you very much for letting me share my ideas.
Thanks, Louise. Thanks very much for sharing that with us. Really, really interesting. Okay, so now I'm going to hand over to Karen.
Thank you very much. So interesting just to hear the other speakers as well. I've not managed to actually read all the other chapters, but it's just made me even more keen to do that, and just generally such a really exciting project to be part of. So I'm so happy to be here today to just tell you a wee bit about the chapter that myself and my colleague Nick put together as our contribution to this amazing book. So the title, as you can see here, was Between Two Worlds, a shared shamanic journey of creative qualitative data analysis and researcher identity. So I'm just going to start off just by letting you know the kind of background to how the chapter came about. And really, we document part of that within the beginning of the chapter, it being what we call a conversational ethnography. So we very much take a situated approach to our work, and it's written entirely in first person. And so it begins off by setting the scene, and I say a wee bit about the background about my own sort of questions that I brought to the work, and that's really grounded within my own narrative ethnography on a hidden population of women who use drugs that I had conducted for my doctoral thesis. And essentially, that project engaged with the narratives and the experiences of 21 different women who had various different experiences of using various illicit drugs, including psychedelics. And what I found from that project was that, conventional research methods not only fail to account for reflexivity and the role of researcher subjectivity within the creation of that data, but I would say one of the things that I was really left pondering after completion of that project was about the real paucity of conventional and traditional qualitative methods to do justice to what were essentially non-ordinary states of consciousness that were being reported by many of the women in my study. So I knew that using traditional methods to try and grasp at that, the same themes that we've heard with Kate and Louise saying there, it was complexity, there was ambiguity there, and there was a sense that, what I was dealing with here was something much bigger than what I had the tools to be able to capture and deal with. So it was very much a creative process for me, trying to find different ways to be able to capture that complexity in their stories. So what I arrived at was using a combination of methods to do that. So I used dialogical narrative analysis based on the work of Frank. And in order to be able to locate myself within that in the way that I feel that any sort of data cannot be taken in separation from the mind that it's constructed by, was I used reflexive autoethnography there as well to try and embed and insert myself where appropriate within the text. So that allowed me to capture at least some of the more relational, sensory and embodied aspects of my own. But still, I was left kind of dissatisfied, and again feeling that there was lots of aspects that were still unaccounted for in the final output. And one of them was not only about, the limits of ordinary language to capture these very sort of fantastic experiences that many of the women were describing to do with their psychedelic drug use. But I knew there was also aspects of my analytical process that I was not able to capture there. And one of those was that the role that dreaming and these deep states of altered consciousness played in my analysis of the women's stories and experiences. But still, I felt very much that I had been balancing the competing desires to, do something creative and innovative, but at the same time sort of trying to, strive for conformity and respectability and indeed acceptability within my final output as well. So I actually didn't speak much about the role that I felt that dreaming had played in the process. And what that was is essentially when I was really deep within the narrative data, I would find that I would wake up in the morning and I had answers to some of the sort of questions and the puzzles that I had been grappling with. So I did feel that dreaming was an aspect of that analytical process and it was important. However, it wasn't till I met my colleague Nick within the context of the Scottish Psychedelic Research Group that I started getting a sense, that he had many similar experiences in conducting his doctoral thesis on the role of spirituality in men's recovery from substance use. And what really struck me from talking to Nick was that he was way more confident and assured in actually including some of these more creative and sort of non-ordinary ways of analysing data actually within the output itself. So Nick had developed a method of shamanic journeying, and I'll explain what that is in a second. And he had actually used this as a way of making sense of the men's qualitative data within his study as well. So from getting to know each other and from chatting, we realised we had many similarities in our thinking, many questions that we were still sort of grappling with post-PhD. But also there was some clear differences there, including the confidence that he had, maybe compared to some of the resistance that I had to maybe including some of these different ways of thinking about the research process. So inspired by the work of Ellis and Boschner, who use a method of conversational autoethnography, we decided to put this chapter together to explore some of the questions that we had and really how our identities outside of the academy had shaped our creative processes to data analysis. And this sort of really reflecting on what for me is that dynamic process of working relationally in research as well. The project definitely evolved and was quite fluid. And in the end, although we were going to start off comparing both our different methods, we ended up deciding to focus on Nick's unique use of the shamanic journeying method. And really we were guided by some questions to go through that process. And the key one was whether Nick's method that really requires highly specific skill sets and qualities, could that be passed on and taught to other researchers? So really tapping into that idea about, thinking about what is quality research, obviously, I think one thing that's really stuck with me is in the manner, even though we're often trying to generate different ways of doing things, is that we're still very much often haunted by what I call, the ghost of positivism in that sense that we have to lay some sort of pathway that maybe others could follow. So these were some of the questions that we used to guide our journey together. But we're also intrigued by what are the main challenges when pushing the boundaries and when exploring creative qualitative approaches to analysis, particularly in the context of mainstream research spaces, in this neoliberal university context where we do experience very strong sort of influences to talk about our research in certain ways and to create specific outputs that meet specific criteria. So what is shamanic journeying to assist this process then? So this is taken from Nick's sort of definition of what shamanism is. So Nick is actually a nurse practitioner and also a shamanic practitioner as well. And he describes it as a set of ethnically contextualized practices employing altered states of consciousness for healing in tribal group cohesion, okay? So shamanic journey, and some of you might know what that is. It might be kind of new and sort of sound really out there to a lot of you. And I know that from talking about this chapter to my colleagues and stuff. So it seems like something that's, you know, really fantastical and interesting to a lot of people. But essentially, there are many different ways that you can understand it. So some people see it as a spiritual practice, and then it can also be understood in terms of a more neuropsychological framework as well. So it involves a process of inducing a light trance state, and that's typically attained through rhythmical drumming in order to access what's been described as this non-ordinary reality. So as is sort of captured here, although the basis of it, you know, what it actually is, what these altered states mean, how real are they, indeed, what is these big questions relating to truth and imagination. I think what Nick saw as constituting was perhaps quite different from what my understanding was. So again, that was something else that was really interested in working through in our journey together. So what we did is we decided for me to experience the shamanic journey and process. So Nick actually, he brought me into a space and he used the drum beat, and I essentially lay down on the floor, and he asked me to have a question in mind. And my question, so this process is always guided by a question, was for me to have greater insight into the way and my process of analysing qualitative data. So I'm not going to go into, I don't have much time here, and I'm not going into great detail about my experience of that actual shamanic journey. I will say it was really enlightening, actually, and I do capture this within the chapter. So if you're interested in that, I would encourage you all to get the book and to read it. So what I have decided to include for you there is my post-journey reflection. And this is a process that was engaged in dialogically between myself and Nick. So after the journey, I had basically wrote some notes, and then we both sat together and we engaged in a dialogical process of trying to make sense of what I had experienced. And it was very real and very visual to me, to my surprise, because my fear had been that, you know, I wouldn't actually experience anything and I wouldn't have anything to talk about. Thankfully, that wasn't the case, and I really did gain something very meaningful from it. So I'll read out my post-journey reflection. In that dialogical space of knowing we had created, I realised that my endless shamanic journey was a symbol for how I experienced my process of data analysis in my PhD. So often struggling to arrive at a definitive interpretation in the women's stories, grappling with a sense of meaning that seemed to constantly shift and escape what Frank calls finalisation. So Frank's approach to research methodology and the politics of interpretation, which he describes as being haunted and provoked by the Russian philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin, problematizes the manner in which research subjects can be overly determined by claims to have captured the essence of their character. So this resisting finalisation as a way of preserving the complexity and ambiguity in my thesis was a concept that was actually strongly reflected in my experience of the shamanic journey. So my analysis of my storied data very much mirrored my analysis and my reflection of my journey to what they call the lower worlds within the shamanic journey. And I was left feeling that it was frustratingly incomplete. So although I did experience something quite profound within the shamanic journey, I was still felt as though, you know, it was more of a process than a destination. And this is something, although that itself was hard to put into words, really captured and gave me answers to the way that I actually do analyse qualitative data. So it really ended up quite meaningful. Now, some concluding thoughts. So yeah, we do agree, and we work out some of the questions that it generated within the chapter. And we do agree that the experience of these early experiments with shamanic journey and to aid the qualitative process, the analytical process, we do feel that it has something interesting and innovative to contribute to several aspects, and that includes enhancing, as my experience shows, enhancing researchers' depth of understanding, not only into the data itself, but also about their own analytical process. But like all good qualitative research, and I'm always saying this to my students as well, it probably generated more questions than answers. And this, for me, is what's most exciting about this method. And some of the questions that I've been left trying to make sense of, and that I probably still don't have complete answers to, are what aspects of our classed and gendered positionalities might account for the varying forms of resistance both felt and encountered by myself and Nick. And I really feel that my gender in particular, and also my background as a working class first generation academic, really accounts for a lot of the resistance into some of the sort of more creative and alternative aspects that I felt the confidence to include within my thesis. And another question that arose was, how much should we think about vulnerability and difference when using such methods? For there was a moment, and I speak about this within the chapter, that I did feel quite vulnerable experiencing the shamanic journey method. And again, that was something that I was able to bring to Nick's attention. And I think that was a product of my classed and gendered positionality as well. So I'm going to stop there. I hope that whoever reads the chapter finds it as interesting as much as I enjoyed being part of it. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to any questions that any of you might have.
Thank you, Karen. That was great. So we're going to have questions at the end. So Jess, I don't know if you're...
Yeah.
Share screen. Thanks so much.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. Hopefully you can see that okay.
Yeah.
Now, so what I'm going to do is, I'm Jess Mannion, and I'm going to talk about a data analysis method that I co-created with the Relationships and Sexuality research team. And we're a research team from Ireland who have learning disabilities and neurodivergence. And we do research on sexual citizenship, and we use visual and creative research methods. So as part of our research, we do co-produced action research. So it's important for everybody in the team to be engaged in all stages of the data, or all stages of the research process. But when we got to the stage of the data analysis, this is something we weren't sure how we were going to do it. We believe if participants are engaged in analysis, they're not only involved in all stages of research, but it will add a deeper layer to the findings. Together, they can check if anything was omitted, misinterpreted, or needs to be taken out. And the meaning on important topics can be explored further. So I went to the literature to see what I could find. And either co-researchers with learning disabilities are not engaged in data analysis, or academics are not writing about it, but there was very little guidance in the literature. And we really wanted the method to be accessible and creative, and that's something that we could enjoy and really learn from. So we decided to create our own systematic 6-step method of data analysis, and we called it the Creative Collaborative Data Analysis. And how it came together is the research team had their own ideas, and we also drew from existing ideas in the literature, not necessarily research for people with learning disabilities, but data analysis methods, such as visual analysis, member checking, content analysis,
Sorry,
and embodied.
Jess.
Yeah.
It's your slides are still on the first slide, so I was just checking.
Or did it not move? I'll come out again. Maybe if I do it this way. Can you see that now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll leave it like that
Brilliant.
instead of
Sorry,
sharing.
Jess,
No, that's okay. And embodied data analysis. So what I'll do is I'll briefly go through the 6 steps that we have, and in the short time that I have. So first of all, we did what's called visual analysis. So we asked everybody in the group, you asked them to choose a topic that they want to do research on. So for example, one of the topics we looked at was, what are people's perspectives and experiences of sexual health education? So then what we did was we decided what creative method would help us to explore this topic. So each research meeting, we choose a different method. We used art, third objects, drama, Lego serious play, rap, poetry, and joint sandboxing. So we would ask people, so we come up with a research question, and we come up with a method, and we explore it through that method. So we create a metaphor to be able to help us to explore it. And then when that's done, each person should share their creative output and what it means to them. And then this should create a further group discussion, and this discussion should be recorded and then transcribed. So I didn't want to take this data away and put my own interpretation on it. I wanted it to be true to the core researchers. So I did member checking. And member checking can help ensure that the interpretations gathered are accurate, and they give additional opportunities to discuss the findings with the participants, because it's possible that the participants change over time, or that their perspectives change over time, which we saw. So the researchers should listen to the recordings of each data collection meeting and make a 10-minute video summarizing the main interpretations. And then before the next meeting, you should send that to them. So I emailed it to them with a list of reflective questions, so they could respond to my interpretation of the findings. So here people can vocalize if interpretations are incorrect and if data should be added or omitted. But we still had a lot of data. So in our first project, we met for a 2-hour research meeting every 2 weeks for a whole year. So we had a lot of textual data, and that was not accessible to researchers with learning disabilities. So I had to find a way to cut it back to make it more manageable and meaningful for people to work with. So the textual data should be systematically categorized by finding patterns in the words used. The repetitions of words is presumed to signify importance. So the researchers should identify word frequency by counting and selecting the main words in the transcripts. And then you omit words like in, and the. And then the keywords should be written on postcards. So this approach leaves it more manageable data for the participants to work with, but will enable meaningful engagement with the data, where the participants can dig deeper into interpretations and provide a more complete picture. So I brought these word cards into the research meeting and put them out on the table, and we all sat around the table. So here you should ask participants, choose a word that's the most important to you, and then ask them to create a visual and drawing of the words to express its meaning. And then they'll be asked to share the visual interpretations, which should lead to a further group discussion. So now we have some main themes to be able to work on and what's most important to the group. Now, we did this several times throughout the study, and you still have a lot of themes. So we need to bring this together and see what's most important. So this stage is called embodied data analysis, and it's really like creating an art installation where you take all the artifacts through the study. So this can be theme word cards, artwork, poetry, and so on, and display them in the room. And a lot of people put these on the floor, but it wasn't very accessible, so I raised it up to a table. And you can play any audio recording. So for instance, we made raps, so they were playing. And then you ask participants to move around and play with the data. They should be asked to lift artifacts or themes from the table of things that are most important or that stands out to them. And if they hear something that's important, in order to represent that, they can write that down onto a blank postcard, say from the sounds of the raps. So when everybody's decided, yeah, we're happy with what we have, we should remove all data from the table, anything that's not important, and participants are asked to place their chosen data on the table. Participants should then share what they have chosen and why, which should lead to a group discussion. And then while discussing the data, the participants should decide, what are the main themes here? Is there any sub-themes? Is there any irrelevant data that we can remove? But then I think it's important to come back and look at this again. So I would recommend having a later research meeting where the participants can review their analysis and bring back that removed data and present it to participants just to ensure that nothing important has been missed. And it'll give the opportunity to debate the data further, create further sub-themes, and remove any repeated or irrelevant data from their previous analysis. So then the last step is a creative collaborative reflection, where at the end of the project, everybody comes together and decides what questions do we need to ask to reflect on this at the end, and what visual and creative methods would we like to do it. So we did 3 sessions using sandboxing, Lego series play, and third objects. So for example here, the co-researchers came up with the question, what's the biggest thing we're going to take away from this research project in this group? And they brought in found or made objects to be able to represent that, and they shared these and their interpretations, and it led to a whole group discussion. So this happened throughout the whole study, and it was a lot of work. And my reflection on this is, for it to work well, I believe that the participants should have a strong working relationship to be able to do it, and the project should be over an extended period. So this project was, the initial one was a year, and the creative data analysis was the whole way throughout. It wasn't just something at the end, and it does take time. Although the co-researchers found some of the method creation and analysis was hard, they also said it was fun and interesting. And it provided a platform for everybody to be heard and to gain insight into other people's perceptions. The co-researchers learned about data analysis, and their confidence grew in the process. So we think that our co-creation of a new creative, collaborative, and accessible method of data analysis is a contribution to research and will provide future opportunities for participants in co-produced studies to analyse their data. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jess, and thank you to all our speakers. And I know, I think.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks from me also to all the speakers. It's just really nice to kind of hear people talking about the work, and it kind of reminds you that talking and writing are kind of different ways of hearing about people's work, but really complementary ways of hearing about it, from my point of view. So we have got some questions in the Q&A. We've got a little under 15 minutes left. So we'll try and deal with as many questions as we can. Feel free to keep adding questions in, and we'll pick up as many as we can. So we'll start with a couple for Kate, and then we'll kind of move on through, and we'll try and make sure we get some questions for it, at least one question for everybody. So Kate, we'll just go with the first question here. I do think it's really interesting. I assume that you did all the drawing yourself. Are you also an artist? How can people without those skills aim to do something along these lines? Would you advise hiring artists? So I think you deal with this in the chapter, but it'd be really interesting to hear you talk about this.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I am not a trained artist. I think I picked up a pencil for the first time since school about 6 years ago. Very much enjoyed doing stuff without the expectation of being able to do it well. So just enjoyed experimenting. So no, I'm not a trained artist, but obviously the more I've used graphic methods, I guess that I've improved. If you look at the book itself or the chapter, I think there's some images in the chapter, you can see, we're not talking high art here at all. What I did decide quite late on in the process was that my own drawing was not good enough to publish. And so what I did was I found a graphic illustrator who took my drawings, worked on it with Adobe Illustrator, and kind of smoothed them out and neatened them without losing my, shall we say, rustic style. So yeah, I know people will always say to me, I can't draw. But there are other ways of doing visuals. A visual doesn't have to be comic characters or beautiful drawings. There's many other ways, as I think people have explained as well, of using visual methods.
Thanks, Kate. That's brilliant. So I'll try and combine. There's two questions here, one from Tristan and one from Emma. I'm going to try and combine them. So from Tristan, could you say a bit more about how you approached the organization of your data? For example, how did you decide which character you gave particular experiences to? And Emma's kind of point is, did your participants have any input in the creation process, and did you get any feedback from people on the finished? Yeah, could you take those two?
Yeah, I'll take that the second question first.
Yeah.
All the participants were anonymous, so I couldn't share what I was doing with them, and it wasn't an intended outcome of that survey. As I mentioned, the report was the outcome. I did publish some information internally within the university about what I was doing. I published widely on social media about it. So whether people picked up from it, I don't know, but I didn't do any sort of official member checking, shall we say, or anything like that. In terms of organising the data, I mentioned that the characters each occupied a kind of particular stage in an academic career, so from PhD to professor. That also kind of had an impact, well, obviously had an impact on how their lives were being affected, how their work lives were being affected in terms of the type of work they did, the type of tasks that they did. It also had an impact on life stage. And I mean, generally, I think how we experience COVID was also impacted by our life stages. And that was the case here, but there was this combination of professional and personal, and the type of domestic circumstances people were living in, so whether they were in large families or young children or a single or partnered, that had different ways of interacting with the professional aspects that had come up through the survey data. So yeah, that's probably the best way I can describe it in a very short time.
Thanks, Kate. That's brilliant. Okay, Louise, I think there's a kind of technical question here about what software do you recommend for creating word clouds, and how do you edit out the interviewer voice?
Yeah, so there are free bits of like web-based software, but they tend to have less kind of manipulability or kind of ease of editing bits out. So I would recommend using some computer assisted qualitative data analysis software. I used NVivo, so I'm pretty familiar with that, and it was a really helpful way of making comparisons, because the data often people code the data to specific people or specific groups of people, which then allows you to take bits out and make comparisons and things like that. So that software is generally, I think, the best way to do it, because you've got much more ability to make changes and take out what you don't want in.
Brilliant, Louise. And another one here for you. I'd not heard about the people view template. Thanks for sharing that. Could you say a bit more about that?
So pupil views templates were developed by a group including Kate Wall and Steve Higgins. There's a book from 2007, which you still can get copies of. Kate and Steve have also written and published widely on this, but there's lots of different templates, and they have kind of changed and adapted since 2007. So they've been used in different ways, and they're a kind of visual mediator, so a way of prompting discussion with often small groups. And they are also a tool that can be used across kind of practice contexts. So teachers and educators can use them in schools to explore various aspects of learning, as well as a research tool. So they're kind of like a pedagogical research tool that Kate and Steve have written quite widely about, along with others.
Thanks, Louise. That's brilliant. Okay, Karen, there's one for you here from Tracy Farrell. She says, thanks, Karen. So interesting. I look forward to reading your chapter. My question is about the tension you felt between honouring innovation and meeting the more traditional neoliberal expectations. Has writing this chapter led to conclusions about what you'd do differently, or recommendations for us who feel the same tension?
That's a wonderful question, and I don't think I would like to say that I feel more confident at the end of it, but I feel that that tension itself is something that is very creative and productive, you know, because I think that there's always a fine line that you're actually, when pushing boundaries, because we want to create something that is meaningful, that allows us to think about things differently. But at the same time, we do have to take seriously, you know, the quality of that. And we can't, something that I always struggled with was maybe, you know, how much of my own reflexivity do I put in there as well, without actually taking away space and the meaning of the participants, which of course is why we actually do this work in the first place. So for me, I think that these tensions are really productive. I don't think we can ever resolve them. For me, it's about being as reflexive and as conscious as possible while we're grappling with them. So I wish I had an answer. I think that it's really nice. It's always good. I think even just hearing the other people, I think that's what's also really important and powerful about this work. For me, sometimes, especially when you're exploring different methods and alternative ways of doing things that maybe others don't value the same, I think that it can be really helpful just to hear that other people are struggling with the same things and the same contradictions and the same tensions. So again, for me, as long as it opens up a space for conversation and reflection, so that we can work out answers together, then for me it's definitely worthwhile. So I don't know if that answers your question, but definitely happy to chat about it more with you, Tracy, if you would like that.
That's great, Karen. And just to kind of say that I think this is a key theme running through the book, about how people handle um, disciplinary and institutional norms and expectations, and the kind of accompanying anxieties of choosing to work in ways that might sit outside. And I'm just reminded of the chapter Dawn of a group of women working in a STEM discipline, and the kind of the way they had to kind of deal with similar kind of tensions and expectations. That's great, Karen. I mean, just to say that Rob Smith's also put in the chat there, reminds me of the body, mind, spirit orientations coming out of Central American literature, which is a really nice connection. I just want to make sure that we get in a question for Jess, because I'm just looking at the time. So there's one here, Jess, from Emma Craddock. Without positioning the researcher as knowing better than the participant, there are skills that researchers learn and a frame of analysis and theory that researchers bring which participants won't necessarily have. What happens if participants don't see such things that might be relevant in the data? A lot of early feminist analysis of women's oppression would not necessarily have been recognized by women at the time, if that makes sense.
A really good question. So that was our method of data analysis, but then I had to write a thesis because this was part of my PhD. So there was like a final step for me where I needed to analyze the data through a theoretical lens, which I did through the theory of sexual citizenship. So in that way I brought it in, but there was one perspective that I had a little bit different than the co-researchers, so I wrote about that as well in a reflection at the end of the thesis, because we were all in this together and we all had a different opinions, and to try and get everything across. So I think you have your role as a researcher when you're writing academic work, so it's to add that element, but also being true to the co-researchers that you're working with, and being true to what they want other people to hear, and you're as close to their perspective as possible.
Thanks, Jess. Okay, well, I think we're kind of 2 minutes to go. So I just want to say thanks very much to everybody for coming. Thanks in particular to our 4 authors for agreeing to come and talk about their work today. I think you all did a beautiful job, and it's lovely to hear about it too. From my point of view as a co-editor, it's been such a privilege to be part of this this book, and I'm very proud of it, even though other people did most of the hard work, as is always the case in an edited collection. So hopefully today will have inspired some of you to go and read it further too. But thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've had a chance to look in the chat boxes, but there's loads and loads of positive comments about your work being inspiring and people being inspired by it, and lots more questions. So you may get emails from people later asking you lots more questions about your work. But yeah, thanks so much. It was really lovely being involved with the book, and really nice to be able to hear you all talk to your chapters today. And thanks to Bristol University, Jess, and to Baha for hosting too.